Hello, everybody, and welcome. I tried this back in June and it failed miserably. It just didn't work, crashed all the time. And I'm hoping it's going to work first time this time round because we're going to be dealing with a particle system and we're going to be doing some collision and physics. Things can go a bit haywire. So bear with me if that happens. Unfortunately, we're going to delete the default cube. Once we've removed the cube, we're going to go in and add in a curve, a sapling tree generator. If you don't see that, go to your preferences, go to add-ons, search for sap, and you should have the add curve sapling tree generator. Let's get rid of that and go ahead and add in. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time at this point going through the various options you have with the tree. You may need to open up the operator panel. Remember, you can press F9 to bring it up on your cursor at any point. Do bear in mind, if you do anything else, move it or add another object, you will lose the ability to edit your tree. So just bear that in mind. One of the things I do find useful is under geometry at the top here, you can scroll down and we have some presets. We can change this. I actually prefer the white birch of all the different trees, and I'm just going to scale it down to about 8 for this particular project. I'm going to move my viewport so I can see a bit. And now let's go to the next most important thing, what we're going to deal with today, the leaves. Let's go ahead and select leaves and then show leaves. The moment we do this, you can see it's pretty sparse. Now, a word of warning, you can change a few knobs and sliders here and there, and it turns out you just crash Blender. So just be aware that a lot of these things compound on one another very, very quickly. So at the moment, leaves are placed at the last branch. So if we go to our branch splitting, we can see we've got 2 levels of branches. If I go back a level, we've just got the leaves on the end of the branches here. If we do another level, we get some more. And if we do another level on top of that, you can see Blender was a little bit delayed there, and it might on your computer freeze for a few moments whilst you're doing this. So just bear that in mind. I'm not going to go too far when it comes to this, a max of 3 here. Now, if we have a look a bit lower down, we've got some branches. This means for every of the second level of branch, there's going to be 60, and on those 60, there's going to be 30. So you can see by adding 1 to here, we're adding another 30 branches to the tree. I believe that's how that works. And of course, you can see how that can compound and crash Blender. So I'm going to lower that down ever so slightly. I'm going to go to 40 here and then increase this to 50. And that should give us a lot more leaves on our tree. In fact, I'm going to risk it and go up to 60 on that front. I'm going to leave it as that. So you can densely populate your tree if you want. I don't recommend it. Let's move away now from playing with the tree setup. I'll leave you to play with this. I have great fun with it, but it does, as I say, cause Blender to lock up or at least process it very, very slowly, as will this next area. So we're going to go to armature. We're going to use the armature. That will take a few moments to do. And the reason why we're doing this is so we can animate our tree. I originally just had this with the tree, the leaves changing color. And I thought, oh, it looked really awesome if it was moving around. And then I thought, oh, it could shed leaves as well. Anyway, we also need to make it a mesh. And the reason for that is we're going to be using a particle system in a bit. And if we don't make it a mesh, well, we cannot attach particles to a curve, which is what makes the tree already. Again, we're waiting for Blender to catch up there. We're going to go to animation. This will take a few moments to do. I'm going to tick all of these: leaf animation, armature animation, and fast preview. And your computer may take a few seconds to work through this. Okay, so leaf animation done. Finally, fast preview does make a big difference. So I'm going to tick that so we can see what the tree's doing. And in a few moments, we'll be able to play back our animation and check to make sure we like it. Because the moment we finish this, that's it. Okay, the moment we move away from here, our tree is done and dusted. We can't go back. We can't easily edit anything. Okay, brilliant. We've got like a skeleton tree here. Finally, before I move away from this, I like having a bit of a gust every now and again. So I'm going to put a value of 3 into the gust strength. Then it needs to recalculate the animation. So this is something to bear in mind. If you're playing with this and your computer's really being slow at the moment, rewind, go back to the point where we start adding the tree, but don't add quite so many things. In fact, this is being a bit slower than when I first tried it out, so perhaps I've overcooked it a little here. But once this is done, I can move on with the rest, and we can start placing some ground for the leaves to fall on. That's going to be crucial. Okay, so that's done. Let's rewind to the beginning of our animation, press play, and we can see the tree is moving around. Now, I'm only playing back at 11 frames per second. That's absolutely fine. That's going to give us enough information. I can see that the tree's working how I'd expect it to. Okay, let's go ahead, add in a plane for the ground. I'm going to scale that up something like 10 or 20. And then I'm going to zoom out a little here, press Control and 5, and that will add 5 levels of subdivision. I'm going to apply my scale. Anytime you're doing anything with physics, make sure you have a scale factor of 1. Otherwise, it can go really, really wonky. And then down here in our properties panel, we need to go to the physics tab and enable collision. Now, we'll come back to here later on, but to keep things nice and brief, we're going to want the leaves to fall down and hit the ground and stick. So I'm going to turn up the stickiness. I don't want it to kill the particles. That would make the leaves disappear when they hit the ground. We don't want that in this particular case. And the damping, we don't want them once they've landed on the ground to move around. Now, I'm not sure whether the stickiness at a setting of 10 is going to make too much of a difference. I have had it set to 1. I have had it set to 10. We'll see what happens and we'll adjust things as we get there. Okay, so our ground is pretty much set up, but I do want it to be a little bit wibbly wobbly. So I'm going to add in another modifier. I'm going to add in a displace modifier. So we're going to move those vertices around. I'm going to scroll down to that, create a new texture, click on these little tabs, or I always think they look like pills. I'm going to click on that, scroll up here, where it says image or movie, I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to choose Voronoi. And there we go, we've got a nice shape to the ground. Now, you may want to turn on smooth shading at this point, and I'm going to apply here my subdivision surface modifier, because what that's going to allow me to do is go into edit mode, find that central vertex there. I'm going to turn on proportional editing and then go G, Z, and pull that up ever so slightly so the ground is raised where the tree is. Something like so. I'm going to turn off proportional editing because if I don't, it will screw me over at some point. Now you can come back to your texture and play with the size of it. Sometimes it being a little bit bigger helps with the ground. I'm fine with it how it is for the moment. I'm not going to play too much with the details here because this can be quite an intensive process. Right, we need to find one of these leaves. So I'm going to select my object. I believe I have a leaf done. Yeah, I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to press A twice to clear my selection, enable face select, hover over a leaf and press L. I'm going to duplicate it with Shift and D, press escape and press P to separate it and separate it by selection. We now have a leaf that's far from the origin. We want to place it back at the origin. So you can try and press Alt and G, but it won't move it for the moment. It won't reset its position because it's so far from there. But what we can do is make sure it's the active selected object. So I'm going to come out of object mode, select that individual leaf. I'm not going to be able to do it in there. So this is where we use our outliner. And it's probably under here, under tree mesh. Here we go, leaves 001. I just want that to be called leaf, and I'm going to clear the parent. So whilst it's selected, Alt and P, clear parent. Right, now that is done, we need to put it to the center of the scene, or rather move the origin to the center of it. So I'm going to right click and set the origin to the geometry. And we can see it's moved there as well. So it's not quite doing what I want it to do. So if I press tab, you can see it does jump to there. And so it is doing it, but why is it over here? Well, let's have a look at the modifier stack. Yeah, we've got an armature. It's still being controlled. So let's delete that. And then we have it right at the center. And we can go Alt and G and place it at the bottom of the scene. Now, you could move it elsewhere out of the way. Bottom of the scene, it's not going to be seen by anyone. Okay, so that's done. We can now use that object as a particle. So make sure you've got your tree selected. And this is where, if it's still a curve, you would have a problem because we're going to add a modifier and we're going to add a particle system. Right, now that we've got our particle system here, I'm going to go to its options and now we start to play with it. I'm going to make this area bigger so we can see what's going on. So the number of them, well, what happens if we just press space for the moment and start playing back our animation? I don't, oh, look, there are particles falling out the bottom. So this is the part of Blender where it can just go a bit haywire. Blender and particles can be a bit difficult to wrap your head around sometimes. And sometimes you get two different results for the same thing. Now, I found a number of leaves around 1500 is good for this. Now, I'm just going to go down here and read off a list of settings. Now, do play with them, see what happens, but they're all pretty self-explanatory, at least to begin with. So we have the number of particles, how many there's going to be in total. Frame start and frame end. So they're going to be produced, those 1500, they're going to be produced over frame 1 to 200 out of the 250 that we have. Now, the lifetime is 50. So at the moment, if one is spawned on frame 1, it will die on frame 51, which means it will disappear. We don't want that, so I'm going to make the lifetime the same lifetime as the scene. Then they're all going to exist forever. Right. The next thing I need to do, and we'll come back to caching in a bit, but the source, this is important because at the moment we don't want it emitting from faces, we want it emitting from vertices. When we do that, rewind, this is very important, and we've got this red pinky bar along the bottom here. If I press play, you'll notice that we start moving along, and look, the particles are there, and they're just falling from the tree, almost like snow at the moment. And yes, that's a great start, but we really want it going off to one side, and we'll play with emitters in a moment to help us with that, but let's kick them off in the right direction as well. We'll come back to caching in a bit. That's going to be very important to make sure we don't end up with any render artifacts. Velocity. So this is its initial speed. So we've currently got a normal of 1 meters per second. I don't want that at all. I don't want it to go off to the normal of whatever the vertex was. That probably won't make any sense. I just want it to go off in one direction. And in this case, I want it to go off in the Y direction. It keeps it nice and simple. I could have some sort of combination of X and Y, but in this particular case, Y is fine. I'm going to put in 5 meters per second. This is quite quick, but we're going to change it in a moment because when we play this back, you'll notice that they do go off, but they drop down quite quickly. So it's almost as if the leaves were quite heavy, and they are, and I'll show you why in a moment. We do want rotation, so I'm going to tick that, and we'll probably come back to this later on as well. In fact, I'm going to put a little bit of randomness in here straight away. I don't think we need to play with anything else. So I'm just going to minimize that back down again. Physics. Let's go into physics. Here we go. We've got leaves that weigh a kilogram each. That's a lot. So let's go back in here, and I'm going to type in 10 grams instead. Rather than going 0.01, you can actually type in grams, which is really, really useful. Now, I'm going to play a little bit here, Brownian forces. Well, let's put that at like 0.2. That kind of makes them wiggle around a little more. That's the best way of describing that. You can see at the moment here, they're falling onto the ground and they're just flowing off. So there'll be a few settings that we need to play around with and get working. Because at the moment, we have some sort of elaborate waterfall and not leaves hitting the ground. Okay, shut down physics for the moment. Render. This is probably as far down as we're going to go. We're not rendering as a halo anymore. Let's render as an object. And the object instance, we will pick the leaf, which we set up earlier. Now, when you go ahead and press play now, you will think that it's not working. It is, in fact, working. And if I pause and zoom in, we might be able to catch those little specks. Oh, I didn't pause it. There we go. So there are these little specks here. That's no good. And that's because of the scale underneath. We need to set that at 1. Then they are the same size as the leaf. The next thing here, random scale. Yes, I do want a little bit of random scale. It helps break up the scene just a little. Don't put it too high, otherwise you end up with bits flaking off rather than whole leaves. And in this particular case, I do just want whole leaves. If you're doing debris or something blowing up or falling over, perhaps you do want various sized particles being blown around. Okay, now that is the beginning pretty much nailed. We need to sort out it dragging on the ground. We'll get to that. But the next thing I want to move on to, which is going to make a big impact on how this is looking. So we have a couple of forces that we can add. I'm going to add a wind force and I'm going to add turbulence force. And as they sound, they're going to make the wind blow a little further and we can change the direction, which is really, really useful to control how quickly these leaves are falling down. And the turbulence makes them basically kick up and not just go off like a shower head of leaves. We do want them to be a little bit turbulent. I'm going to add the turbulence to the middle of the scene. So Shift and A, right down at the bottom here, we've got a force field, and I'm going to add turbulence. Now, I'm not going to do anything to that setting for the moment, and I'm going to dive in and straight away add in a wind. Now, the wind is directional. So I'm going to pick that up. I'm going to look at my scene from the side. I'm going to pick it up, place it over here and rotate it around and slightly down. And that's all I'm going to do for the moment. Let's press play and have a look at how this is looking for the moment. Well, something's going on here. The leaves are flying off backwards. That's no good. So let's play with the settings. Let's bring this down. So either with the wind or turbulence selected, you can go down on your properties to the physics properties. And when you go ahead and click on that, we can change the settings within. Now the wind here, I'm going to set it as a strength of 0.2 to begin with, and then 0.2. And I'm also going to do the turbulence. Well, let's see what it's like now we've changed the wind ever so slightly. We've made it weaker. That's better. Look at that. So bearing in mind here, if we're playing back at maybe 25 frames per second, this is only 1 second worth of animation. And we can see the leaves are falling off. Now, if we zoom in, we can have a better look at what is actually going on, how they're behaving. And now we've got the effectors there. They are not just going straight off. They're coming back. They're twisting. They're turning. In fact, twisting and turning is a good thing to watch out for. So if you keep an eye on just one of them, is it falling straight and looking really rigid, or is it just going with the flow? And we can see here they're starting to settle on the ground as well. Now the question is, will they end up just settling on the ground, or are we going to have to play with them a little more and trying to get them to really stick? Because what we don't want in the animation is all these leaves to land on the ground and then just go all over the place. It'll just look ridiculous. But they can still move when they're on the ground, so that's absolutely fine. What we don't want is a jittering effect. Oh, look, it's picked up speed there. So that looks like the wind can actually be bumped up a little. It was too high before, so I'm going to increase the strength here. I'm going to increase it to 0.5. Now, hopefully this is going to blow them just a bit further from the tree, because really I want the scene to be filled up. So when we set up the camera, which we can do now whilst we're letting this play, I'm going to press 0 on the number pad, which should make sure my cursor's over the right window, 0 on the number pad. And then I'm going to use Shift and the tilde key. It's next to the 1 on most keyboards. And then I can use WAS and D to position my camera. And this is as jerky as it seems. Now, this is something to just bear in mind, that you won't always get a perfect shot first time. And I've been practicing and playing around with these settings for absolutely ages. It's taken a whole day's worth of playing to try and get everything sorted. Now, I quite like that. It looks like they are settling as well. It still looks like they're a bit uniform. So I'm going to go to this turbulence, and I'm just going to bump up the size a little. See if I can get them moving a bit more frantically. Now, bearing in mind that every time you change one of these settings and you've changed it halfway through your timeline, it's not accurate, because these affect it right from the very beginning, which is really, really important to realize, because everything is based upon its initial conditions. You change a little thing and the whole animation can go wonky. I'm going to grab this wind. I'm going to look at it from the side, and I'm going to angle it down just a little bit more, trying to force them onto the ground nice and early. And I'm going to lift it up here, and that should keep things going. Now, the way that the wind works is you can see that there actually has a fall off. So the further it is away from that emitter, the less impact it's going to have. Okay. Now, we've played around with emitters, and again, you can play around and tweak this to your heart's content. The next thing is to get this looking a bit better. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to click on the ground, and you can set up a fancy shader or use textures here. I'm going to use plain colors just for my own sanity and to speed along the tutorial. I'm sure you guys know how to add textures. If you don't, ask in the comments and we'll get something provided for you. Okay, I'm going to make the ground a sort of dark greeny color. Maybe on the yellow side, something along those lines. Can't see what's going on at the moment, and this is something that you'll have to bear in mind when you're working with this. You won't be able to see how it all looks together straight away. I'm going to click on the tree. I'm going to, let's just name my material. I got really confused when I was working on this, and I didn't name my material. I'm also going to pause this for a second. Okay, so we've got a ground material. And then if we click on our tree, we're going to have a tree material, and I'm going to call it tree. And then we're going to have a leaves material as well, which we will need to apply to both the leaves on the tree and the one that's hidden in the ground. Let's make our tree a browny color. So brown is just a dark orange. I don't know, something along those lines for the moment. And then finally, our leaves. Now I'm just going to give our leaves a plain color for the moment. I have got the leaves selected, yes. So new, I'm going to call this leaves. And we're going to animate this in a moment so we can change the color. I'm just going to make them bright green to begin with. And then I'm going to find my leaf, and give it the same material. Perfect. Now what we should see, I'm going to skip forward to maybe 180 and the leaves appear in the wrong place. That's fine for the moment. Let's just hit the render and see how this appears. There we go. So we've still got a light in the scene and we'll sort out all of that in a bit. I'm not sure I want that light in the scene, so I'm going to get rid of that at the moment. And then once I've sorted out the materials, I will go and play and add additional light in the scene. We'll change the environment lighting to suit. Okay, so that is looking horrible. They've gone the wrong way because I've clicked later on. In fact, what I'll do right now, I'm happy with the animation. Let's say I'm not refining it anymore. I'm going to go to my particle system. In my particle system, I'm going to go to cache. And once I'm there, I'm going to click bake. I'm going to save my file first because it won't allow you to do it until there. So YouTube tree recording. Okay, once you've saved your file, you'll be able to click bake. And then it's just a waiting game. And notice that red bar along the bottom that was faded is now bright red. Once you've baked an animation like this or a physics simulation, it's locked in. It doesn't matter if you tweak any values, those are locked in. And it should mean it actually plays back a little quicker as well because it doesn't need to calculate anything. It just needs to move things. So I'll let that finish off and I'll be back in a moment. Okay, welcome back. The bake has finished. I'm just going to press play. Yes, it's much, much smoother now. So I'll get an idea of how it's going to look in the final render. It's a bit jittery as they come down. That'll be fine for the moment. As I say, you can refine this to your heart's content. And all I would literally be doing is changing some settings here and there and trying to get to a decent one. In fact, I think I am going to go ahead and do this because it's going to demonstrate something extra for you. So I've baked this physics simulation, which means that I can't just go ahead and change things. Before we do anything else, we're going to have to delete all bakes. That is very, very, very important. If you don't do that, it won't work. And I'm going to set it back. Now, sometimes Blender remembers things and doesn't let go. That is really annoying when it does do that. So in this case, I'm clicking delete all bakes. It still says I've got 250 frames in memory, which is no good. It's annoying when it does that. Occasionally, if it does that, you can go ahead, save and revert your file, which is just the same as reopening it again, and then it's cleared it from its memory. It's a bit quirky like that and something you need to watch out for. Otherwise, when you start going through here, you can very quickly end up in a bit of a pickle because it doesn't work. You start changing things and you don't know why. And it's because that cache needs completely clearing. Restarting Blender can clear it if it doesn't when you click delete all bakes. Turbulence and wind. In turbulence and wind, there is a setting under the physics properties for absorption. Now I'm going to click both of those, and on the ground itself, there's a field absorption. I'm going to turn that up to 100. Now I'm just going to press play and see what happens to those leaves as they hit the ground. Unfortunately, well, it takes the same time to play as it does to bake. With that in mind, I'm going to go to my particle system and rebake the simulation. Then I can play it back. It's going to be much quicker. And if I need to work on it again, then I can do that. Okay, so that's finished off. Let's press play and see how this looks. Again, play around with your settings, see if you get something that you like the look of. I really want these to have a bit more rotation to them and a bit more spin, but it's just the way it is at the moment. In fact, they're going quite far. No, they're still not sticking to the ground. So let's play around with the ground. Let's go to its settings. Scroll down here. Stickiness, it's set at 10 at the moment. Oh, look at that. I missed friction. So friction, if I set that at 1, it should stop the leaves moving. I can't believe I missed that. Never mind. It happens. I'm going to increase the stickiness as well. What did I have it on before? 10? Why not? Let's crank it all the way up to 10. You never guess what the next thing is. Go back to our settings. Make sure it's on frame 1. Come back to our cache. I'm going to delete the bake, delete all bakes, and then bake again. Now, it's just one of those things whenever you're doing any type of simulation. I did say right at the beginning, didn't I, that it can be interesting. It can end up throwing you a gooseberry. That's not a saying, but it should be. Okay, with that bake done, I've got my fingers crossed here that it sticks to the ground, doesn't have a waterfall effect. Let's have a look. I'm very, very keen to see them land. Now, bearing in mind, I'm still at 10 frames per second. Look at that. They're actually sticking to the ground. That is fantastic. I don't like how linear they are at the moment, but I will consider this a win because they are sticking to the ground. So there we go. I think we're all sorted with the particle simulation. Now let's get these leaves changing from this lovely vibrant green that they are to something else. Now we're going to actually change the color of the leaves all at once to begin with. So they're all various colors, all various shades of green. And we'll change those colors. We'll animate it so they change from that bright green through to yellow and orange. Let's go ahead into our shading workspace where we can work with this. Now, I prefer a vertical shading workspace, so I'm going to switch mine round now. I'm also going to hide this stuff around the side. Okay, so one of these will need to be the 3D viewport. So let's go ahead and change the one on the right to the 3D viewport. And I'm going to look at it from the angle that the camera will be. Now I'm going to switch this over into rendered mode. We won't be able to see everything when this happens. Oh, one thing to bear in mind is the technique we're using to do a multicolored array of leaves here is cycles only. If you're not doing that, then you can not use it, but I would in this case stick with cycles. I'm probably going to get some artifacts on my recording as I change around those. So we've got green leaves here. So what I'm going to do is find the leaves themselves. Now, this base color I'm going to plug into a color ramp. This factor is going to be controlled by a random per island. And we can see here, if we have a look, we've got different colors of leaves all over the place, or rather different shades of gray. Now, there's nothing white here. That's something to bear in mind. Actually, I think there might be. There's just no light in our scene. So that's just something to bear in mind. If I switch over to the material preview here, we can see we've got lots of different shades there. Let's change it back. So what we want is to fill this up with a load of green. So I'm going to go to where it's black here and change this color, make it brighter, set it to one of these greens, come here, maybe a little bit brighter. We can already see it's taking effect over here. And finally, maybe a bright green, but quite very saturated, but also quite dark like so. And there we go. We've got a tree. Now, at any point, you can go ahead and hit render and just see how it comes out. It looks like my tree trunk is also green. I must have, well, yes, up the top here. I assigned it to the wrong thing. So let's go ahead. And, we are actually on our tree here. That's why it's gone green. So let's switch that out for tree. Let's select our leaves. They're still leaves. Let's render that out. And here we go. That looks pretty good to me. We've got a nice variety of greens in the tree. So that's how you can easily do this setup with multiple trees. But now what we can do is animate that. So I'm going to go ahead, produce myself a new window and change it to a timeline. If I can, stop it. There we go, timeline. Now I want this to run from one all the way across. So I'm going to hover over. There's two things that you can change here. If you hover over the color, we can press I and put a keyframe in for the color. The other thing that you might want to do is its position, but that doesn't make any sense for this at the moment. So I'm going to leave that as is. Now you need to do that for every single one of these. So there should be 3 keyframes for each one of these handles that you've got. Okay, now I've done that, I need to go further along in the scene, and I can do it multiple times. So I can go to maybe 125, which is halfway through the scene, and give myself some more autumn colors. So I'm going to come in, select this green, and go for a saturated orange. I'm going to press I over the top of that to make sure that's keyframed in. If you forget this, it's a real pain because it's unforgiving. It makes sure that you know about that. And I'm going to have a brighter yellow here. That's a bit greeny. Let's bring that a bit more here and a bit more saturated. Press I. And then finally, around 200 or so, I'm going to go for deep colors, maybe a red. Make that quite, well, not too dark, but maybe less saturated there. And then we're going to have some browns here as well. So I'm going to make sure I key that in. I'm not sure whether I did key it in. Let's go to this one here and, ooh, could I just make them darker versions of their previous selves? I think that might actually work. I quite liked the brighter color. Yeah, I'll leave that like that, I think. I'm going to key that in. And now what will happen is as we go through, you'll see that all of these colors change, which is pretty awesome because that means they'll change in our scene as well, including the ones falling off. And I think that's brilliant that I can scrub through now. So let's just render the scene like that, see what it looks like. Yeah, that's looking fantastic. Right, so we're almost there, but we can use the same trick we've just done for the colors, but we can use it to hide some of the leaves from the tree so they actually fall off and the tree ends up bare. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to use the same sort of thing. We're going to use a color ramp. We're going to plug in the random per island. Now, instead of these three, I'm going to delete one of them. And what I'm going to do is set one of these to black. Oh, I've zoomed in too far, obviously. Let's set one of these to black and one of them to white. So black and white being 100% of something and 0% of something. So in this case, I do want a saturation of 0. There we go. And this is definitely black. Let's just double check. 0, 0, 0. Perfect. So what I want to do here is plug this into the... let's move across a little so we can see. We want it plugged into the alpha. So we're going to come out of the color and into the alpha. And what we should be able to do here is move this and actually make things disappear. So if I now render this, we should end up with the leaves all gone. And we're going to have to split out what's on the tree versus what's being blown. They're now two separate materials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and select my leaf that's on the ground. This one here. Scroll down, material. I suppose I could do this over here as well. I could just click that too. And then I'm just going to delete that part of it. And I'm going to rename that Leaves Fallen as well. Okay, so we've got the leaves coming off the tree versus the leaves on the tree, which are two different things. So what we can do now is we can animate the position of this. Now, I don't want it graduated like this, otherwise your leaves will fade out, which is no good. So we're going to go to linear and change it to constant. So we've got a hard cutoff. Now, at this point, we can move this backwards and forwards, and we really want it gone by about 200. So we can go to 200 and put in that keyframe. I can also type 200 in here. Now what I want is this one with a position of 1. So I'm going to key that in. And then I can just go back to the very beginning of the frame and set the position here to 0 and key that in. Now you'll notice here that the thing is black still. So we don't want a position of 0. We want like a position of 0.00001. Otherwise, everything will be invisible and then suddenly pop in, which will look horrible. Okay, I've keyed that in. And what we should now get is as we go, leaves will fall off. These leaves will not only disappear randomly, which is awesome, they will also turn color. They'll actually disappear, but they're not really gone. That's the brilliant thing about this. Right. So the final thing really is to get it set up with light. So let's go ahead to our environment settings. I'm going to make sure the surface is a background. The color here, I'm going to select sky texture. That's going to be a bit bright. We can sort that out by turning down the exposure. So I'm going to jump back to my render settings here, scroll down under color management. I think we've got exposure, usually about -3. I found a good setting to start with. Filmic, you can make it high contrast if you like that sort of thing. Do not turn on freestyle. Your computer will lock up. There are so many leaves to draw a little border around. Do not do that. This looks absolutely fantastic if you use motion blur. It also takes a lot longer to render. Your mileage will vary. Okay, so that looks pretty good at the moment. You can play around with the lighting. I prefer the sky being a little bit more blue. In fact, I did one render. I'll show that on the screen now. I did one render with the sun setting in the background, but I couldn't really see the changing leaves when I did that. And I wanted to demonstrate the changing leaves. So finally, we can render out. Now, when it comes to rendering an animation, there are a couple of things to remember. First of all, if it's your first time rendering out this animation, don't render it out at 4K and super high details. It's just not necessary. If you've got an NVIDIA graphics card and can take advantage of optics, do so. But actually, in this particular case, I'm going to use my render settings. So we've gone to the camera icon, the render properties. We're going to scroll down to where it says render. And I'm going to change this max samples. I'm going to set it to 64. and make sure denoise is turned on. By default, it's the open image denoise. And so when we go ahead and render now, this is 1080p. We'll change that in a second. We're just going to get a ballpark figure for rendering. It takes about 6 seconds. Okay. And actually, that's quite a nice bit of light on our scene as well here. Right, brilliant. So we've got 6 seconds. That's what I said before, didn't I? Can we make that any quicker? Now, bearing in mind, we're rendering 250 of these. What we could do here is scroll back up under the output settings, either set this at 50%, which will actually be less than 720p, or you could set this to 720p. Let's just try and render this out, see if it's any quicker. It's about half the amount of time, which is good. Now we're going to render out the animation. Before you do this, please remember to make sure that you've got your frame rate and everything else set how you want. I'm going to set it to 25 so that it's 10 seconds of total animation. The next thing that I want to do down here is change my step. When I do my final render, I'm going to leave that as 1. But at the moment, I actually want it to step through rather quickly. So instead of rendering 250 frames, what I could do is increase the step to 10, and it's only going to render 25 frames, which should be much, much quicker to actually have a look at. Or we could do 25 as a step, and then it will render out 10 frames. So we get a sample at each point through the animation. This is so critical. The number of times I've rendered an animation, and somewhere halfway through, something goes terribly, terribly wrong. And if I just stepped through the whole animation before I hit render on a final render, and especially if you're using Sheepit or paying for render services, you do really want to make sure that your render's up to snuff before you send it off for that process. What are we going to do here? Well, I'm going to render out to a folder that I can gain access to really quickly. I'm going to go to my desktop here. Downloads. I'm going to go tree test because that's exactly what this is. I'm going to render into that folder and I'm going to call it tree test. I'm going to make sure I'm in that folder. Tree doesn't have 2 R's in it. Test. I'm going to accept that. PNG's fine. Usually rendering out as an image sequence is a good thing. I'm just going to switch it to FFmpeg video so I can have a look at the video as soon as it's done instead of having to put it all together. I'm going to do MPEG-4 and I'm going to set the encoding quality, the output quality to high quality. I'm not going to play around with anything else for the moment. So what this should do is render out basically an MP4 that I can watch back, and it should be individual frames. Let's press Control and F12 and get that rendering, and I'll see you back in a few moments. Okay, so that took no time at all. That's far better than 16 minutes is going to be the full render time if I just let that go. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Let's go up to the top here, render and view animation. And what we should get here is a step-by-step, every second, having a look throughout our entire animation. And just to finish off, this is the final animation that I actually got from those stop frames you saw a moment ago. I did go back and I moved the turbulence around and tried some other settings, and it went from what you saw before to this lovely dynamic. So just a few tweaks and I got to this stage. I'd really love to see what you guys end up making as well. So if you followed along with this tutorial, I'd love to see what you've made. Pop over to my Discord, the link's in the description, and come and share your work there. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.